After studying this module, you shall be able to A. Understand the concept of research process in cross-cultural psychology. B. Highlight the evolution of cross-cultural research methods. And C. Critically analyze each method. In our previous sections, we have discussed in detail the theoretical issues and challenges that can hinder the quality of cross-cultural research. This text may be taken as a follow-up to the earlier issues, as this text will be again discovering in detail the definition of the construct. However, the similar issue will be shared from the methodological perspective. As we are delivering in the methodological issues of cross-cultural research, the text will highlight the steps in cross-cultural research process. Thereafter, methodological issues are shortly discussed in the framework of cross-cultural research. The issue of comparability will be explored in detail, which is the first step in defining the problem. Let us begin with the steps of cross-cultural research process. Now, starting with the cross-cultural research process. As other researchers in mainstream psychology, the processes in cross-cultural research rotate in circular direction. Each step taken by the researcher is constantly evaluated throughout the process of the research, though it moves in a logical direction, but it is continually under surveillance at each step of its notion. Research questions. It is indeed a great challenge for a researcher to formulate the problem statement in the cross-cultural research. The major challenge that researcher encounters during the process of CCR is in searching for the grounds of comparison. Since the nature of constructs selected from two different under investigation is different in nature, the ground of comparison has to be discovered. Developing an approach. After deciding the problem of the research, it is important that the researcher decides the perspective of the research. Different perspective of cross-cultural research includes sociological, psychological and anthropological perspectives derived from the disciplines. It is also important for cross-cultural research to decide the stance that the researcher will take insider's perspective, emic view, versus outsider's perspective, etic view. This will be further discussed in forthcoming chapter. Research design. After finalizing the research question and approach, the blueprint of the research is prepared. The layout includes the setting of collecting primary data, paradigm of the research, methods of collecting data, tools and techniques, and translation and back translation of the tools for two cultures. Thereafter, the data is interpreted. The researcher has to be sensitive to the cultures during the preparation of the tools. Analysis of the data. After the collection of data, researcher seeks to identify the differences and similarities from various samples. The data is prepared for the analysis, standardized and compared. The constructs are equivalent to avoid methodological fallacies. Methodological issues in cross-cultural research. At the outset, within the paradigm of mainstream psychology, methodology in an experimental research or correlational research follows the basic assumptions, keeping all environmental and cross-cultural factors constant. True effect of independent variables on dependent variables are being examined. But in cross-cultural research, the main methodological issue is to compare two cultures that had been controlled till date in mainstream psychology. The major idea that the construct had been understood and defined according to Western middle-class population cannot be generalized to the other populations. Puertinga and Malpass observed that such frameworks cannot be generalized to cross-cultural studies because it can lead to misleading results. Since culture is itself a variable, it is imperative to decompose the culture and rule out of the true variables within the culture that create variations between psychological variables across cultures. At the same time, commonalities in the psychological phenomena amongst the cultures are explored. In short, the design and the methodology should be built in such a way that the research can unpack the culture and rule out the rival hypothesis in the design itself. Development of cross-cultural methods. The aim of the cross-cultural research is to make cross-cultural comparisons. The nature of questions that are formulated in cross-cultural research is to examine the cultural differences on the concerned psychological variable. Therefore, the methodology focuses on yielding the response on psychological variables observed across two or more cultures. On the basis of the results, the researcher demonstrates the comparison. But the only challenge is to determine the aspect of cultures that is producing change in the psychological variables. To understand the aspects of cultures, various levels of cross-cultural comparisons are done. First one, ecological level studies. The first form of cross-cultural comparison can take place at the ecological level. It is the largest frame of reference that we can take. Within these studies, the countries or cultures are the unit of analysis. The detection of ecological level dimensions is significant because these dimensions are utilized as conceptual structure to forecast and describe cultural variations. The research helps us in elucidating the relationship between different ecological data. The data reveals that the averages estimated for psychological variable is restricted to the cultural dimensions on cultural level. The nomothetic findings are not generalized to the ideographic data. Thus, this kind of cultural comparisons takes a larger domain of the community, leaving aside any generalizations, which can be for any individual in a country. The data comparisons are quantitative in nature, based on the descriptive level of analysis. This kind of analysis gives a reduced form of understanding about the nature of psychological process, gives a microscopic view of the cultures. The other issues that can be confronted refers to error of interpretation, also known as cultural attribution fallacy. This fallacy may project culture as the main source of difference between groups. This happens without an empirical justification. Second, cultural level studies. The problem was attended by Marcus and Kitayama's work that identified self-construal as a significant mediating concept between culture and individual. This gave rise to the second forms of cross-cultural study known as cultural studies. These studies produce thick descriptions of complex conceptual methods of culture. These studies help in predicting and explaining differences between cultures or specific countries. These studies engage in exploring the specific aspects of the culture that affect the psychological processes under investigations. The studies recruit participants from different cultures. These participants are studied on psychological variables. The response of these participants are compared on two grounds. A. Commonality of psychological aspects across cultures, and B. Specificity on a psychological attributes across cultures. The comparison also tries to reveal the reasons for these variations. It revealed that people of different cultures differ on psychological variable. The only weakness of such comparisons are that there are doubts on real frameworks that accounts for different cultures. The only weaknesses of such comparisons are that there are doubts on real frameworks that accounts for differences in cultural processes. Third, linkages studies. The third forms of cross-cultural comparisons are done through linkage studies. Though cultural studies gave thick descriptions of the ingredient, but it is unable to give predicted differences between cultural elements like self-ways, worldviews, affordances and cultural practices to the observed difference in the groups. Various types of linkages studies includes unpacking studies and the experiments. Unpacking studies. Within unpacking studies, culture targets towards more specific situations so that the context of each culture get unpacked. These studies estimate the specific amount of variations that are observed in context. Further, it attempts to infer how these context variations affect the cultural differences. Few of the context variables can be studied at different levels. A. At an individual level. Context had been popularly understood in terms of the individualism, collectivism dimensions. Innumerable researchers measures context in terms of individualism, collectivism dimension. They used multi-method approach for measuring individualism, collectivism. Few dimensions that were included are values, beliefs, attitudes, behaviors that exhibit individualism, collectivism dimension of the culture. B. Linkage study also attempts to unpack the manner in which culture construe its true selfhood. Marcus and Kitayama developed the self-construal scale that exhibits the variations that cultures display in their self-construal on interdependence and independent selves. However, recent researchers contest the structural validity of these scales. C. The third variables that are studied as context variables are cultural practices. The cultural practices highlighted behavioral presentations of the culture. Few cultural practices that can be highlighted are child-rearing practices, nature of interpersonal relationships, educational practices, personalities that advocate the particular cultures, and so on. Experiment. The second form of linkage studies are experiments. Within experiments, researchers manipulate condition of the culture and see its effects on the psychological variables. Unpacking studies follow quasi experimental design in which independent variables can be manipulated. There are majorly three types of experimental based linkages studies. A. Priming studies, B. Questionnaire based linkages studies, and C. Behavioral studies. A. Priming studies. Within priming studies, a researcher manipulates the mindset of the individual to link its effect on changes in the behavior of an individual. Such kind of linkages studies gives an overview of the impact of cultures on the behavior of an individual. One of the interesting studies conducted by Trifamo, Triandis and Goto showed the effect of priming on the way people behave. The subjects from America and Chinese cultures were given two kinds of instructions. The nature of instructions was primed to think either in collective mind or a private mind. The instructions were, for next 2 minutes you will not need to write anything. Please think of what makes you different from your friends and family. In contrast, for priming in collective mind, the subjects were instructed to think common grounds on which they are similar to their friends and family. Thereafter, each of the participants were given an assessment scale in which they were asked to complete the sentences like, I am. Thus, the study had four kinds of group. A. Chinese participants that were given instructions primed towards the primitive mind. B. Chinese participants that were given instructions primed towards the collective mind. C. American participants that were given instructions primed towards the primitive mind. And D. American participants that primed towards the collective mind. The response of the subjects was scored according to the individually oriented and collective oriented responses. The result showed priming affects the responses of American and Chinese culture in the similar direction. To be more explicit, if the subjects were primed with group orientation instructions, the responses were followed in group orientation for participants regardless from American and Chinese culture. The inverse holds true for the instructions primed in individual orientation, whether belong to American or Chinese group. B. Questionnaire-based linkages studies. Few questionnaires are also used to unpack the links that are between the behaviors and personality. Few of the questionnaires that assesses cultural dimensions include A. Uncertainty and avoidance. These dimensions are assessed through uncertainty orientation scales developed by Schupper and Sorrentino. To assess the cognitive dimensions across cultures, questionnaires like Need for the Cognitive Structure Scale, Tolerance for Ambiguity Scale, Need for Structure Scale are developed. Certain scales unpack the emotional dimension of the cultures like Emotion Regulation Questionnaire. Emotion Regulation Scale from the Intercultural Adjustment Potential Scale. Certain scales unpack the emotional dimension of the cultures like Emotion Regulation Questionnaire. Emotion Regulation Scale is extracted from the Intercultural Adjustment Potential Scale. Few tools that links the motivation scales of the culture include Power Distance, Power Scale of the Schwartz Value Survey and Portrait Value Survey. Dominance Scale of the California Psychological Inventory, Conscientiousness Scale. Few of the methodological issues that one confronts in performing these studies is related to conceptualization of the variables that can be commonly understood in all cultures. Wijber and Leung defined bias occurs if score differences on the indicators of a particular construct do not correspond to differences in the underlying trait or ability. Equivalence refers to the measurement level at which scores can be compared across cultures. As we can infer from the above definition, the two major aspects about a test is highlighted in the definitions. 1. An equivalent test that can indicate the differences and similarities about the construct across culture in their test scores. Second, if the measuring instrument are unable to exhibit these variations through their test scores. They are formulating the biased opinion about the culture and cannot be applied to larger context. Thus, every test will range in equivalence and biasness in their test scores along the continuum. The test that shows high level of equivalence is more suitable in cross-cultural research than the test than the tests that have high level of biasness inherent in them. In the following chapters, we will explore the kinds of equivalence and biasness existing at every stage or research. In deliberation, we will also identify the methods and techniques by which we can increase the extent of equivalence and reduce the biasness. In our concluding comment, we will reflect on the possibility of achieving equivalence tests across cross-cultural psychology. C. Behavioral studies. The strictest way of performing behavioral studies in cross-cultural psychology is to perform experiments. Within experiments, one attempts to link the variables by manipulating actual environments. Within such experiments, the researcher attempts to explore the links between the actual environments that is tentatively understood to be produced the cultural differences. The idea is that through experiments, the exact aspect of culture can be located and characterized. For example, in a study conducted by Yamagishi, the participants from Japanese culture were recruited and divided into groups according to the level of trust. The participants in the experiments were asked to cooperate by giving money. These groups were further introduced to two conditions. In first condition, punishment was contingent on lack of sanctioned payment, while in the other, the sanction system was not responded at all. It implies whether you pay will all depends on an individual and was independent on any reinforcement. The results of these experiments showed within the condition where no reinforcement was given, the subjects with high level of trust in the other person will cooperate more than the people with low level of trust. On the other hand, the condition in which punishment was followed for sanctioning system, the people with low level of trust collaborated more than people with high level of trust. Similar studies were replicated on the American culture, where they found the similar results are observed in American culture. This indicates the sanctioning system works in all cultures. However, such kinds of sanctioning system are in the effect in only American culture. Final thoughts. Cross-cultural psychology had undertaken the goal of mapping psychological variables across cultures by discovering the similarities and differences observed in psychological constructs across the cultures. Indeed, there is a need to incorporate such findings in the psychological research. With the evolution of the methods from ecological to cultural to linkages studies, the cross-cultural studies had been able to pinpoint psychological variables that can be distinctively recognize the cultures, subcultures and so on. However, the need of an hour is to evolve more kinds of linkages studies across countries and cultures. Few steps in the direction involve coherent organization of citation that we receive on cultural phenomena. Further, one can combine various levels of studies, that is, different contexts, different individuals, and different countries and cultures, and different ecologies to reach to a multi-level analysis. Effective statistical techniques that will be discussed in detail in sampling and measurement issues in our following module will share the statistical analysis of the above findings at a significant level. Finally, an urge to call for mixed methods, that is qualitative cultural level studies and quantitative linkage studies, can bring a precise broader picture in cross-cultural studies. Summary: this module seeks to explain the various methodological approaches to cross-cultural research. The steps that involved include formation of research question, development of an approach, planning a research design, and analyzing the data thus obtained. The various methods for cross-cultural research include ecological studies, cultural studies, linkage studies, which is unpacking and experiments. The experiments again include three approaches: priming studies, behavioral studies, and questionnaire-based studies.